Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come together, to spend time with you, to spend time in the Word, and to spend time with each other. God, I pray that you would enlighten our minds, help us to understand what is being said in the Scriptures and how it applies to our lives, how it applies to our relationships with you, with each other, and with ourselves. Help us to bear better witness, to bear better fruit, to be better disciples in every way. Help us to conform to you and to be motivated to conform to you in every way, in thought, word, and deed. I pray that you would have your hand over this Bible study and help us to be edified and built up by this discussion. Thank you for your grace, your mercy, and the blood that you shed. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Amen. All right, this is week 37. We're doing 1 Corinthians 9 and 10 this week. And we are going to get started here in chapter 9. Let me find it really quick. All right, chapter 9, verse 1. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. All right, so this is coming off the previous chapter where Paul was discussing the weak brother and strong brother in terms of the eating the food sacrificed to idols. And so that's the context for this chapter, and the next chapter is this idea of the Corinthian Christians' rights, their liberty, and the relationship between the Corinthian Christians' rights to do things according to knowledge versus the imperative for them to do things with the motivation of love. So that is the context with which he's talking about here. And so Paul asked them to let go of their right to eat meat sacrificed to idols, just as he has let go of his own rights as an apostle. So that's what he's saying here when he says, am I not an apostle? And then he says, if I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you. And so there were those among the Corinthian Christians who doubted the apostleship of Paul. And Paul says, it's okay if others doubt my apostleship, but you should not doubt my apostleship because you are my very seal of apostleship, right? He built this church, he founded this church, and he was a mentor to this church, and they are the very proof of his apostleship.
I was reading that new commentary that there were a lot of, probably more, the Jews and some of his apostle brothers that struggled with the fact that he was teaching that, moving away from the traditional Jewish teachings of circumcision and dietary laws and keeping the Sabbath and all that. So I think this is partly where this comes from.
Yeah. So there's he's been talking a bunch.
Well, they shouldn't be really questioning it.
Yeah, and so he's going to go on here and give his defense in these upcoming verses. But he's already talked in the previous chapters about why the Corinthian Christians see him as so low. He gave a list of things, right, that he does manual labor,
Oh, that's the other. Yeah, that was another
and
one.
he does. So he's gonna. Yeah, we'll
They
get
don't
on.
have to do labor. Their preaching is enough.
Yeah.
But he personally does work. You know, he just doesn't buy into that. You know, he does work. Anyway.
Yeah, so that's what he's going to get into here, verse 3. My defense to those who examine me in this, do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? And so here he's going to say, when he says, do we have no right to eat and drink, Paul, like all of the other apostles, had the right to be sustained by the community, by the church, by the body.
Yeah, that's what they said too.
So Paul, it wasn't that the Corinthian Christians were questioning his right to eat, but that Paul had a means. Paul means that he has the right to be sustained by them.
Right.
He has the right to eat and drink at the expense of the church.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he says, do we have no right to take along a believing wife? So he's saying all of the other apostles have wives, including Cephas, who is Peter. So Peter had a wife. Most of the other apostles had wives, but Paul doesn't have a wife. And then, so basically he gives this list, basically saying, right, Paul has this right. He has the right to eat and drink at the expense of the church, and he has the right to take a wife. But he is setting aside his rights as an apostle for the furtherment of the kingdom.
Now, see,
for the preaching of the gospel.
Right.
And that's what he's encouraging the Corinthian Christians to do as well, to set aside their own rights.
Right.
For love.
Right. What he's saying, or what some of these other commentators are saying, that I mean, they may have actually had wives, but they said that a lot of them, they weren't actually wives. They were just females that went along and helped. They went along and helped the ministry, but they weren't necessarily actually married to them.
Yeah, that could be the case as well.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe that doesn't really matter, but
yeah, I think the indication here is that there were women who supported the ministries. Yeah, and there were women who traveled with them. But I think the indication here is that as an apostle, he had the right to take a wife.
Right.
Just as all of the other apostles had wives.
Right.
So he could have had a wife,
sure,
but set aside the right, he set aside the right to expect support. He set aside the right to take a wife. He set aside these rights for the good of the people he was preaching to. And so he's basically making himself the example for the Corinthian Christians here. So, remember the context, he's talking to them about the right to eat meat sacrificed to idols, and the encouragement was, don't do what will cause your brothers to stumble. Right? Let your motivation be out of love and not knowledge. And so then he's giving himself as the example. And so then he goes on to say, verse 7, whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock. Do I say these things as a mere man, or does not the law say the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about, or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Mm-hmm. Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. Right? So he's going to give a bunch of examples here, right? So whoever goes to war at his own expense. So he's basically saying who goes off to fight for his country and has to pay for his own expenses? No one. Right? The soldiers in an army are supported by the army that they're fighting for. Right? Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat of its fruit? Right? Who is going to farm? And that's the next one. Who tends a flock and doesn't drink of the milk? Who's going to be a farmer and not be sustained by the work that he's doing? Right? If you farm, if you plant crops, you eat of those crops. Even if that's not the main priority, even if the goal is selling the vast majority of your crops, you're still sustained by the crops. And if you're raising animals, you're going to be sustained by the goods of those animals. And then he goes on to say, I'm not just using these are not just random examples, right? Then he goes to the law. He goes to the Old Testament, and it says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. And so God gives a command that while an ox is going around in circles treading on the grain, you can't muzzle him because the ox is supposed to be allowed to eat the grain that it's treading on. So you can't muzzle.
Sustain itself.
Yeah, so the ox eats and is sustained by the work that it does. And so it is
same principle.
It was a simple command of humane treatment of a working animal. Right? So when the grain was broken away from the husk, when the ox was walking on it, it would be cruel to force the ox to walk over the grain and not allow it to eat some of it. That's what in Deuteronomy 25, that's what it's talking about there. And the principle, so that's what he's saying, when he's saying, is it oxen God is concerned about? He's saying that, right, the law is not for the ox, right? The ox can't read. The ox can't read the law, right? The ox doesn't know that it's being wronged, and so it's the principle, right? And the principle applies to the oxen, right? You shouldn't mistreat the oxen, but the principle is applicable to all things. So the principle is that the work that you do should whoever is doing work should be sustained by the work that they do, which is what he goes on to say in verse 14. Right? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. And so he's saying, that this principle in Deuteronomy 25 is not for the oxen; it's written for the people. Mainly, the principle is for the people. That those who plow, those who are doing the work, right? The workers who plow the fields and the workers who thresh the floors should be allowed to partake in the work that they are doing, right? So it would be cruel to starve those who are providing and preparing your food, is the principle, right? Because they would hire people to, plow the fields and to thresh the grain, and so it would be wrong to not allow them to partake in the work that they are doing. And so then he applies that principle to the work that he's doing here, right? He's saying if those spiritual work that the apostles are doing, Paul and Barnabas, he's saying, if we have sown spiritual things for you, it's not that much to ask for material things, right? Because the spiritual things are so much better. The spiritual things exceed the value of the material things. So he's saying, according to this principle, it would not be wrong. In fact, it would be right for Paul to reap material benefits from the spiritual work that he does. But even though some people do that, so some people do partake in this right, he doesn't. And and so he's saying he is the more for it, right? So the Corinthians had this warped understanding that because Paul didn't partake in this right, so Paul refused to be sustained by the churches that he was building. He worked to sustain himself, and because he didn't partake in this right, the Corinthian Christians looked down on him. They thought he was lesser because of it. And he's saying, no, I'm not lesser, I'm more. Not in a prideful way, but in the principle that if it's a good thing, not just not a bad thing, but a good thing to partake of the work that you do, how much better is it to refuse to reap the benefits even though you can?
You're right.
And so he says, nevertheless, we, being him and Barnabas, have not used this right, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel. And so his concern is so primarily focused on the gospel that he wouldn't even partake in this right lest it hinder it even a little bit. He is so concerned that the gospel is preached as effectively as possible, that he would not partake in the right to be sustained by the church. That he would rather work, he would rather labor manually to sustain himself and not be a burden on the church, not be a burden on the people he's preaching to, than partake in this right that he has and possibly even a little bit hinder the gospel. And then he says, do you not know that and so then he gives more examples, then he gives more Old Testament examples.
Well, it makes his testimony better.
Exactly, yes. And so he's providing himself as the example. So he gives all of these examples of things that are intuitive in the culture that they were living in, right? The priests in the temples and those who serve at the altars. So he gives, again, Old Testament examples and examples that they're familiar with in the culture that they're living in. Even the pagans, the people who work in the temples and the altars, they partake in the meat that they sacrifice.
Right.
The work that they do in the temples, they are sustained by it. And so he's just giving example after example after example of how intuitive it is that you are sustained by the work that you do. And he says, I'm not going to be sustained by the work that I'm doing for you. I'm going to do even more work to sustain myself so that I won't hinder you in the slightest in preaching the gospel. And so then he goes on to say, verse 15. And so again, he's just affirming over and over and over again his right to be supported by the people.
But.
And then he affirms the right not to use that right.
Yes.
If using it would possibly hinder the gospel.
Right.
And so we're seeing Paul's heart here.
Right.
That whether he's paid or not paid, whether he's respected or not respected, whether he's seen as an apostle or not seen as an apostle, he wants the gospel preached. And he wants it preached as effectively as possible. And so he goes, is it more effective for the gospel? Not Paul. He's not concerned about Paul. Paul's not concerned about what Paul is getting out of this. Paul is concerned about the gospel. And is it more effective for the gospel if Paul doesn't receive support? Well, then Paul's not going to receive support. Is it more effective for the gospel if Paul receives support? Well, then he'll receive support. What mattered was that the gospel is not hindered.
Yeah. And then also God, it's in God's plan. Because like you say in the temple, that's God put that in place. That they would eat the leftovers to sustain themselves. And then just like, the evangelists, apostles, would at least, if nothing else, be fed. Not that they're getting a bunch of extra money, but at least be fed. And then just like in the law, or in the Torah, it gives everybody, like all farmers at least, 10%, the outside edge of their fields is like, that's like a tithe. That's like the 10% of that field, the outside border. Anybody can come along and consume that. That's for anybody. That's like a food bank almost. So I don't know, it doesn't specifically say that, but I have always believed that it's so you won't break the 10 Commandments and steal. Because it's either steal for food to stay alive or, have these provisions. And so this is a good part of God's plan. I mean,
that's why he goes to the law, he goes to the Old Testament, says it's written in the law of Moses that this principle is here, that you are sustained by the work that you do.
Right.
And he's just trying to show them that this is a right that he has to be at least have the basic provisions necessary for life.
It's a no-brainer.
He has that right to ask that of the Corinthians, and he's not asking them. He's refusing that right, and he's showing himself as the example of refusing rights to please God, refusing rights out of love. Yeah. Right? He loves them so much that he's willing to lay down these rights, and this is not rights like we have. Right? We think that every right that we're afforded by the Constitution is a God-given right. No, he's saying basic rights to be fed. Right? Rights that we know are from God. He's refusing. He's laying down his rights. And he's asking that of the Corinthians, but it's also asking that of us. Right? We have to be, right, especially in America, especially in the West, we have an obsession with our own with our personal rights. Mm-hmm. And it's a necessary consequence of freedom and the democratic republic that we live in is that we love freedom. We love our personal rights. We love it. And unfortunately, it's gotten to a point where people love their rights more than they love God, more than they love people, more than they love their neighbor. They love their rights. And we can learn from this. We can learn from the example that Paul is setting here for the Corinthians. He's setting it for us here too. That we have to be willing to lay down not just our rights, right? The principle that Jesus gives us is we have to be willing to lay down our lives for our enemies. What are our rights compared to our lives? And people miss that. People miss this idea that we have to be willing to die for our enemies. That's not hyperbole. That's the attitude that we ought to be progressing towards in terms of the way that we see people. And that's what Paul's trying to get the Corinthian Christians to understand here. It's just going, yes, you're right, but being right is not better than being loving.
Right.
And so, then he goes on to say, verse 15, but I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me. Right? So he's saying, I haven't used these rights, and I'm not writing so that I can get these rights now. He's not trying to hint that they ought to be doing something they're not doing.
Right.
And then he goes on to say,
make it a lot. he didn't. One of them said he didn't. What you're saying basically, he didn't make it mandatory.
Yeah.
That they do this.
Well, and he's not. He's trying to say he's not being cheeky and trying to like go, hey, look at all these things that you're actually not doing for me.
Right.
Because he actually wants them to do it. He's saying that's not why I'm writing these things. Then he says, for it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. Right. And so he's saying he is boasting in his refusal to partake in these rights. His boasting is in the Lord. His boasting is, as he goes on to say, God's grace is sufficient for him.
Right.
And the rest of that verse is, Jesus says to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. And that's what he's trying to say. He's not boasting in himself. He's boasting in God. God sustains him. He doesn't need to partake in these rights because he is caring about the gospel. He's caring about God, and he's caring about these people. More than himself, more than his rights, he cares about these people. He cares about the gospel being preached. He cares about God being glorified. And he says, I would rather die. So I would rather die than have that boasting be void. And so he's saying, I'm not trying to get you to start doing these things that you're not doing for me now. No, I don't want it, and I would rather die than have it. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. For necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. What is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. And so he's saying, he's not boasting that he preached the gospel. He had to.
Mm-hmm.
His boasting was that he got to. He was able to preach the gospel without asking the hearers of the gospel for support. Right? God has blessed him. God has provided for him. God has sustained him to such a degree that he would be allowed to preach the gospel without charge. And that's what he's boasting in. That he gets this opportunity. And he says, for if I do this willingly, I have a reward.
Yeah.
But if against my will, I have been entrusted with stewardship. And so he's saying, he's saying that he doesn't he doesn't preach the gospel willingly. He preaches it because he has been entrusted to do so. Right? This is a stewardship. This is a job. God has said you will preach the gospel, and he does preach the gospel. Right? If he did it willingly, then he could boast in himself. He could say, I willingly, look at how holy I am. Look at how righteous I am, that I willingly choose to preach the gospel. He says, no. It's not willful, it's a stewardship. It is an opportunity that I have been entrusted with. And so this is in the context of the time when a lot of religious people were trying to preach the gospel, not the gospel, they were trying to preach any message they could preach in order to earn money. Right. Whichever message they could preach in order to get money, they preached. And it was a blessing from God that Paul was in a place to distance himself from those people. And so Paul was given an opportunity to preach the gospel and without taking money, so that he couldn't be associated with the people whose only concern was making money. And so he could never he was boasting in the fact that God had given him the opportunity to not be seen ever as abusing his position, his authority. That was reward in and of itself for Paul, that he couldn't ever be accused. He couldn't ever be accused of abusing his position. And so the important thing here, even though we may never be faced with the same situation as Paul in terms of, apostleship and abuse of authority and preaching the gospel, etc., we are all confronted with this idea of what rights are we willing to sacrifice for God? What rights are we willing to sacrifice for the love of God and the love of others? And that's something that that's a question that we're faced with every single day. And then he goes on to say, verse 19, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without the law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you." And so he's saying, even though Paul was free to do what he wanted, right? He was a free man, and yet he willingly became a servant to all men.
Right.
And so, and then he goes on to say, "To the Jews I became as a Jew to win Jews." And so, right, this is something that has been raised against Paul, is that it seems like a lot of his teachings are inconsistent, right? He seems to be teaching multiple things that seem to be in contradiction with each other, and the understanding here has to be he is consistent with the principle. He's consistent with a principle, and that is the supremacy of the gospel. And he's willing to do, he's not willing to do anything. He's not willing to sin, but he's willing to be all things to all people that are righteous and right in before the eyes of God, to win these people. He's willing to do whatever it takes that he can do to win whoever it might be. And so he just was consistently pursuing one goal, to win people to Christ. And so, right in Acts chapter 21, Paul participates in some of the Jewish purification ceremonies, and then in Acts chapter 16, Paul has Timothy circumcised, both of which he has said are not necessary, but things that he did because it was helpful to preaching the gospel.
Well, he says, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So it's, yes, to help you preach the gospel and be accepted by that particular group of people in that area, you go along with their customs.
Yeah, and so Paul sought to win people to Christ, and he was sensitive to who they were, what they did, what they needed from him, and then became that for them. So that they could identify with him, and thereby they could identify with the message that he was preaching. And so this isn't to say that we ought to change everything about. We don't change the gospel to fit people, but we change ourselves to a degree, to an extent. We change ourselves, and the things that we're willing to do, the things that we do, the things that we prevent ourselves from doing, the rights that we lay down, we change ourselves in different circumstances and places so that the gospel can be more readily accessible. And so the principle here is to reach people where they are today instead of forcing them to be who you need them to be in order to reach them. Right? We don't expect people to change first and then preach the gospel. Right? This is a formula that a lot of churches have backwards. Right? A lot of churches want their members to be a certain way before they are allowed to fellowship, and then you can preach the gospel. You're not going to get very many people that way.
Right.
If you need to be a certain way, and you need to do certain things, and you need to stop doing certain things before you're going to experience fellowship, before you're going to experience love, before you're going to experience support and compassion, before you're going to experience the love of Christ through the body of Christ, you're not going to win very many people to Christ. But if you go, I'm going to meet you where you are, as you are, and preach the gospel to you, where you are, not expecting change now, right? We don't expect purity, we don't expect holiness, and we don't expect righteousness from the people we preach the gospel to. Mm-hmm. We expect that after, once the gospel has been preached, if they give their lives to Christ, we expect that after. And a lot of people and a lot of churches have that equation backwards. They want the changes to come before the gospel is preached, before the gospel is seen in action in the lives of those people. And we go, no, we go into the people where they are, as they are, and that's where we preach the gospel. That's where we act out the gospel. And that's what Paul did. Is he was willing to do what needed to be done so that the people could identify with him, and therefore they could identify with the message he was preaching. And he was willing to offend people over the gospel because he wanted to win them to the gospel. Right? And so there's a principle to not unnecessarily offend, but we have to be willing to offend. Right? The gospel is offensive to the ears of the unbelievers. It is offensive. Right? But the gospel is offensive. We need not be more offensive than the gospel is. The gospel is offensive enough. That's the whole point that Paul's trying to make. He's trying to go, I'm going to fit in with all of your customs. I'm going to do what needs to be done. I'm going to do everything that I can do because the gospel is offensive enough to these people. These people who don't believe, the gospel is offensive enough. I'm not going to be more offensive. Make the winning of their soul more difficult. If the gospel is offensive enough, then we go, I'm willing to offend you with the gospel that you might be offended over to salvation. But any more offensiveness to the person is hindering to the gospel. Right? So if the gospel is already hard enough for the person to hear and to accept, if I do other things that make it more difficult, I significantly hinder the person's soul being saved. And so he's saying if it's already difficult, I'm going to do whatever is necessary, whatever it takes for the gospel's sake, that it would be effective in the salvation of souls. So then he goes on, verse 24, he says, do you not know those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. So he says, he's telling us to train and compete like athletes, right? Athletes endure grueling training and competition because they want to win, right? The athlete who doesn't want to win is not going to win because he's not going to train in the necessary way to win. And so he's basically saying that there's a kind of effort required if you're going to win. And so he says, and so his admonition to us is run in a, right? He says, only one person obtains the prize. Only one person can win the race. And every single person who's running the race, in the physical race, every single athlete trains the hardest and best that they can because they want to be the one who wins. And only one can. Right? If every single runner in a race won, right, every single person got the same thing, nobody would train. Why would you train? You could do whatever you wanted and get the same thing as the person who finishes first. But because there's one prize, everyone trains to their best. Everyone trains as hard as possible because there's only one. And they have to be the one or they get nothing. And his admonition to us is train like that. We ought to walk with God in the way that the athlete trains to win a race. We ought to run our race in that same way. Right. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. And so he's giving the example of an athlete. And this was important in the context of the culture, right? They had, in Corinth, they had the second most famous and popular games. The Olympic Games were the most famous and popular, and I don't remember the name. Starts with an I think. But those games were held in Corinth. So the athletes, it was an example that they were very familiar with. And he's saying, right, every single person who's competing for the prize, the crown, is temperate, right? So an athlete has to train in a way where he has to refuse things that he knows in a vacuum are good, right? There's nothing wrong with eating cake. But an athlete who's trying to win a race isn't going to eat cake. They're not going to eat these things that are going to hinder them from their goal, right? So they're going to eat healthy, not because you have to eat healthy in general, but because the athlete has to eat healthy if he wants to be at his best performance, right? The athlete has to endure significant pain and suffering during training, right? And enjoying and relaxing is not a bad thing, but it's a bad thing to the athlete who wants to win, right? And so he's saying every single athlete has to give things up that are in and of themselves fine, but they're bad if the athlete wants to actually win, right? If the athlete wants to win, it's not a bad thing for a person to sit down on the couch and relax, but it's a bad thing for his chances of winning the race if he's not training, if he's not enduring punishment, if he's not enduring
self-discipline.
Discipline, exactly. If he's not enduring giving things up that he knows are fine in and of themselves, he has to be, the athlete who wants to win has to be able to differentiate the things that he can do from the things that he should do. And that's the same principle here. Every Christian who wants to win the race, every Christian who's walking with God, who's running the race in a way that they would obtain the prize, has to be willing to do not what they can do, but what they should do. Because the Christian who is continuously living a life where they do what they can do is a Christian who will not run the race in a way in which they can receive the prize. That's the point. That's the point of the example that he's giving here. And he's saying, how much more should we do this if the prize that we're running for right? The prize that we're training and racing for is not a perishable crown like the games, like the physical race. The spiritual race that we run, the prize that we get is an imperishable crown. So how much more should we do what is necessary to run the race in a way that we would win that crown, we would win that prize? And so he says, I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. And so he's saying, right, the word discipline here in the Greek is to strike under the eye and to give someone a black eye. So he's basically abusing his body. And that's not, some people take that out of context, and we get the practices of self-mutilation for holiness purposes. That's a wrong way of exactly. That's a wrong way of thinking about this verse. That's not what he's saying here. He's just saying that he's using hyperbole here. He's using the example of severe and harsh discipline against one's self, one's flesh, and one's body to bring it under submission. And so he says, I do things, I bring my body into subjection, which is, he made his body his servant. And he made sure that the inner man, the new man, the spirit, was the master.
Not the flesh.
Exactly. And so he had to bring the flesh into submission, into subjection by disciplining it. And the example that he's giving here is physical, is physical in nature, but the point that he's trying to make is not physical, right? So when people physically hurt themselves to try and bring their flesh into submission, you are missing his point, right? You're missing the context with which he's talking about. He's using that as an example because of the example that he just previously used of the physical race that athletes run. And so basically the whole point is he doesn't want his body to be the Lord over his self. And so he brings his body into, he brings the desires of the body into submission to the desires of the spirit. So that, and disqualified here is again an athletic term, right? That the judges could deem someone disqualified, and regardless of how they ran the race, they were not what's the word? Well, qualified, I guess. They didn't qualify for receiving the prize, regardless of how they ran. And so he's saying basically that he walks in such a way, and he brings his body into such discipline, he runs the race in such a way as so that he would be qualified to win the prize, the crown, the imperishable crown at the end, and would not be, merit, that's a good word, that he would merit not merit, but he would be
entitled.
He would not. Basically, he's saying won't be a hypocrite.
Yes.
That he went
deserve that prize.
Well, I don't want to say deserve because it's, the connotation there is like works, like we're deserving this prize.
Okay.
In the example, in the physical race, yeah, exactly. But in terms of the spiritual race, he's
qualified will be.
Yes, exactly. You either qualify because you ran the race correctly, or you are not qualified. Let's say the athlete used performance-enhancing drugs. It doesn't matter how you perform.
You're disqualified.
You can finish first in a race, but if it's found out that you ran the race illegally, if you did it incorrectly, you're not you're not qualified to obtain the prize for the race that you ran. And so he's saying here, and so he runs and he contends and he denies himself and brings his body into subjection to the Spirit so that he would not be rejected for deserving the prize. And so this is the example this is the admonition that he gives to all of the Corinthian Christians and to all Christians for all time, is run your race with God in the way that a athlete runs the race in order to win the prize. And so if the athlete has to do things in his training for the race, right, that might not be good, and they might not be fun, and they might not, he has to deny himself. The athlete who wants to win is going to train and deny himself in a way that will allow him the best possible chance of winning.
Yeah, self-discipline too.
And so that discipline that he's saying here, it's not just discipline, but it's this idea of knowing what is permitted, right? He's used this example a number of times, that we have to be able to differentiate in our Christian liberty what is permitted from what is beneficial, right? All things are permitted to the Christian, but not all things are good. Not all things are beneficial. Right. And if you're constantly living your life where all you are concerned about is this something that I can do? Well, the Christian, under Christian liberty, the answer is always going to be yes. But the Christian who's living their life that way is not living their life in the way that he's describing. They're not running a race. They're not training for the race in a way that they desire to win. And they're not going to be running a race that is going to allow them to qualify for the crown, for the prize at the end of the race. They're not going to run the race in a way that qualifies them for the prize. And so he says, run your races in a way that you would qualify. Run your race, train for your races in such a way that you would be capable of obtaining the prize, and run your races in such a way that you would be qualified to win the prize, that you wouldn't be rejected by the judge at the end. And that's not in terms of salvation, just, right, the prize that he's talking about is not salvation. We're not obtaining salvation by our races. We're not obtaining justification. But the prize is that itself, the prize. There will be rewards in heaven, and differing rewards. And we ought to be aware of that, because it is in and of itself motivation for the walks that we ought to have with God, the races that we ought to run. And so he's not saying, if you don't run as disciplined as possible, you're not going to be saved. That's not what he's trying to say here. Okay, so that's it for chapter 9. Do we have anything we wanted to say?
I know you probably covered this, but like in verse 20, where he's possibly being accused of being all things to all men, and possibly pretending.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting, in this book it says, a person who nurses a sick man becomes, in a sense, sick himself, not by pretending to have a fever, but by thinking sympathetically or empathetically,
mm-hmm.
how he would like to be treated if he were sick himself.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
excellent.
wherever he was, whether it was Corinth or Ephesus, wherever. All you have to do is really, was he pretending to be something he's not? No, he was thinking sympathetically or empathetically that if I was these people,
how would I want
to be treated? Mm-hmm. Would I be forced to do things that is not in our culture or wherever? Being told, all these rules and regulations that I'm not used to following. So so maybe on the outside looking in, somebody could, read the scriptures now, or even back then look at it from the outside saying, oh, he's just, trying to be saying whatever people want to hear and just trying to be everybody to every, to appear to be everything to everybody.
Yeah.
When that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
He just wanted to, he was just being empathetic and putting himself in their shoes.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's really what it boils down to. That's the essence, one of the essence of love is putting yourself in someone else's shoes, and
compassion, yeah.
Treating them or interacting with them appropriately, depending on where they are in life.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So,
yeah. All right, so we'll move on to chapter 10 here. And so in chapter 8, in chapter 8, Paul has established that first, that an idol really is nothing. The Corinthians got that right. The idol, the wooden or metal statue, it's nothing. It's just this material object. It's nothing. And then he is also, and it was fine for the Corinthian Christians who knew this to act according to this knowledge. And then he established this idea that for Christians, love is more important than knowledge. And so there's this understanding that even though you might know something is okay for you to do for yourself, that it's not okay for you to do it if you know that it's something that might cause your brother to stumble. Right? So that was chapter 8. And then chapter 9, Paul is really explicitly trying to get Christians to understand that it's not only is it okay to give up your rights, but for the vast majority of Christians, it's going to be necessary to give up some of your rights. That it is not only is it okay to give up your rights, but if you're going to run a race worthy and acceptable of receiving the prize at the end of that race, you're going to have to give up some things. You're going to have to give up some things that you really like. You're going to have to give up some of your personal rights. And so, just as Paul had to give up some of his rights as an apostle to preach the gospel effectively, Christians have to give up some of their rights to be the best disciple and the best to bear the best witness and to bear the most amount of fruit in their pursuit of loving God and loving their neighbors. And so Paul showed that a Christian must be willing to give up some things, even good things, acceptable things, for the sake of winning the race God has set before us. And so he goes on to say, chapter 10, verse 1, "Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness." And so Paul has been writing right at the end of chapter 9. He gives the example of the race, and he says that there is a danger in not running the race that God has set before us in the way we must. There's a danger to refuse to give up the things to remove, to do what's necessary to remove the obstacles that are preventing us from finishing the race. That get in the way from finishing the race in a way that is acceptable and is pleasing to God, in a way that qualifies us for the crown. And he gives this example here in Israel, for Israel, right? God set before them a race, and that prize was the promised land. And they refused to give up the things that they loved. They refused to give up their ways. They refused to give up their dependence on themselves and their love of idols and gold and Egypt and their lives in slavery. They refused to give those things up, and they did not finish the race. That's the example that he's given here. And so he's trying to say here, right, all of our fathers were under the cloud, and this cloud is the Shekinah glory that overshadowed Israel throughout the journey. Right, during the day, the cloud sheltered them from the sun, and during the night, it was a pillar of fire to keep them warm. And so it was just this constant reminder of God's glory and presence, right? And then all of the people were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, right? So they passed through the Red Sea, and this is a symbolic baptism of Israel into Moses. Right? They all saw the incredible power of God holding up the walls of the sea so that they could cross on the dry ground. It was a picture, right? It was a shadow of baptism. They passed through the water, and they identified in that baptism with Moses.
They both also protect from evil.
Cloud and fire.
Going through the sea, eventually.
Eventually.
They got out, it closed on the Egyptians.
Exactly, yeah.
And so, through our baptism, it protects us from the demonic
forces.
Right.
And it's also a picture of...
So it's physical and spiritual. But
It's also a picture of life and death.
Right. And
right?
the cloud, yes, the spirit.
In our baptism, the old man dies and the new man is alive.
Right.
Just like the Israelites were alive through their baptism and the Egyptians were dead.
Absolutely right.
And so he's saying that was a shadow of baptism, and then he goes, they all drank the same spiritual food, right? The manna from heaven. They all drank the same spiritual drink. That drink is the water. And so the indication here is that either there was a literal physical rock that followed them, and they used, and from that rock, water came, and they all drank from that water, or there was a stream that followed them. That's another interpretation of that there was a stream that followed them where they went, so that they always had water. But so we understand that there's a point in Exodus, God tells Moses to strike a rock. He strikes it twice to bring water forth. And because of his disobedience, Moses doesn't go into the promised land. But he's trying to say here, Paul's trying to say that rock was Christ. The rock that they were getting that water from, they were drinking the living waters of Christ. That was the shadow. But that there was a genuine presence of Christ there in that rock. And so in that, they had the presence of Christ with them in the wilderness, with that rock, and they identified with that rock. And so Paul builds on a rabbinical tradition that Israel was supplied with water by the same rock throughout their wilderness wandering. It was the same rock. And some scholars today don't know if whether that was actually true or not, whether there was a singular rock that followed them or whether it was a stream, but whatever. The point is, Christ was present with Israel in the wilderness and provided the miraculous water for them somehow. And through all of, and so there's also a picture of communion, right? The same food, spiritual drink, just as Christ's body and blood.
Right.
Is our food and our drink.
Right.
They had the spiritual food and drink. And so there's a lot of pictures of Christ in the wilderness, in the wandering, so he's just trying to point out that there were so many spiritual blessings, right? The Shekinah glory, the cloud, the fire, the miraculous food, the miraculous water, and through all of that, every single one of the Israelites of that generation died besides Joshua and Caleb in the wilderness.
Right.
None of them, not even Moses, finished the race.
That's why we're so blessed.
And so, and that exactly, and that's the picture that he's trying to paint for the Corinthians. They were blessed. How much more blessed are you?
Yeah.
Right? They had the shadows. You have the real thing. You have the real substance. They had the shadow of Christ. They had the shadow of communion. They had the shadow of God's presence. Right? They saw and felt his Shekinah glory. God's glory is in you, lives in you now. And so, despite all of the blessings and privileges, the Israelites did not please God in the wilderness. And so, in light of those blessings, they should have had gratitude to God. They should have had thanksgiving. That would have made them more pleasing to God, and instead they were not pleasing to God at all. And so Paul's point here is that the Christians in Corinth were taking all sorts of liberties, right? They were exercising their Christian liberty in a number of ways, feasting in pagan temples, doing all sorts of things, and they thought that they were safe because of their blessings. They thought that they were safe because of their previous spiritual experiences, their past blessings and experiences. And Paul is warning them that just as Israel was blessed with all of these spiritual things, they still fell short. They still ran the race in a way that disqualified them. They still refused to do the things necessary to finish the race. Right? We know that the Israelites were constantly given over to complaining. They were constantly given over to idolatry. They were constantly given over to refusing to trust in God, refusing to submit to Him, to His authority. They were never willing to give up the things that were preventing them from entering the promised land, from finishing the race. And he's giving that same warning to the Corinthian Christians here. You're refusing to give up the things that are preventing you from finishing the race and from running the race that you ought to be running. And just as they perished, some of the Corinthian Christians might also. So verse 6, now these things became our examples, right, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. So that was a problem with the Israelites, is that they were lusting after evil things. And so here's verse 7, he's talking to the Corinthian Christians, and do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Rose up to play there's sexual immorality connotations to that. And so Israel was failing to keep their focus on God, their focus on the prize, and in their lack of discipline, they gave themselves over to idolatry, and they gave themselves over to sexual immorality. So he says, verse 8, nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted. Right? So the people were complaining, and so God sent the serpents, right? And Moses had to build the bronze serpent on the staff that they could look up to, and they would be cured of the snake bites. And so they were tempting God, basically. They were tempting him to They were tempting him just as some of these Christian Corinthians are tempting. They tested God's patience. They tempted God and his patience and his mercy. They tempted his provision and his sufficiency, just as some of the Christian Corinthians were testing God's grace by their abuse of liberty. And so he's saying, as some of them were also tempted and were destroyed by serpents, nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples and written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. And so, he's basically saying that some of the Christian Corinthians were believing that they were safe from any danger of being destroyed because of their past spiritual experiences, spiritual gifts and blessings and accomplishment. And Paul is saying, if it happened to Israel, it can happen to you.
Yeah.
Right? That is the purpose for which these things were written, to be an example for us of what not to do. So then he goes on to say, verse 12, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Right? Super famous verse, and really important application for the individual Christian's life. He's saying, right, the one who thinks, the one who believes that they are invulnerable is the most vulnerable. The one who tries to take a stand and rely and have self-reliance in the face of sin and temptation is the one who is most likely to fall. So the one who thinks he stands, the one who thinks he is impervious to temptation, is the one who is not on guard, who is not wary of the insidious nature of sin, who doesn't understand the depths and the blanking. The one who believes that they are impervious to sin and temptation is the one who is easily going to fall, basically. So then he's saying, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. And so this is really important for every Christian to understand, right? We Christians often want to excuse their sin, often want to excuse the things that they do, the way that they react, the things that they say, the things that they do as very unique, and that it should be an exception to the rule, right? Every Christian wants to justify their acts in their failures in temptation.
Yeah.
Right? That is a thing that is just the way that we are. We're just built with an inclination to justify our wrongdoings, and here he is tearing that idea apart when he says that no temptation, right? And so the principle here is that every single temptation that every single Christian has faced is a temptation that is common. If you are facing this temptation, there are many others now and in the past who have faced who are facing the same exact temptation. Right? You are not given a situation that is uniquely, is the temptation is not uniquely difficult or uniquely, this situation is uniquely difficult to overcome. That's the idea here is that God is faithful, and he won't allow anyone to be tempted beyond what they are able. So multiple principles. Your temptation is not unique. It is common to man. Every single temptation that we face is common to man. Right? We fall into this trap of thinking that our temptations are uniquely difficult, and thereby we are justified in failing those temptations, in giving in to those temptations. Right? We can justify it by saying, well, some people might be facing something similar, but mine's just too hard. This problem's just too difficult for me to be faithful to God. This temptation is just too difficult for me to resist. And other people might have the similar temptations, but this one is uniquely above those. This situation is uniquely unresistible. And so the three principles are: no, your situation is not unique. Your temptation is not unique. God is faithful, so every temptation that you face is a temptation that is not too difficult, right? So no temptation that we face, because God is faithful, because God is with us, He does not allow, he allows us to be tempted, but he does not allow us to be tempted beyond what we are able to face. And the third principle is that always, 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 God makes a way out. There is always a way out. And so, God has promised to us in his faithfulness that all temptations that come our way will be limited. They will be limited to such a degree that if we rely on him, right? So every temptation that we face is too much for us to overcome. Every single one. But here, that's not the principle, right? The principle is not that that we are tempted beyond what we are able in ourselves. God is faithful and will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we are able when we rely on him. So God promises to limit the temptation, so that if we rely on him, we will make it out. So he provides the way of escape, and he limits it to such a degree that we are capable, if we rely on him, if we trust in him instead of relying on ourselves and trusting in ourselves, that we will make it to and through the way out that he has provided. And so he limits temptation so that we are capable of enduring and overcoming it according to his capability, not our own. So we are capable of enduring temptation as much as we are capable of relying on him. Right? If we trust and rely on ourselves, every single temptation is going to be too much for us to overcome. There is no temptation that we are capable of overcoming in ourselves. But every temptation, right? The principle is every temptation, if we rely on God the way he has instructed us to, he will help us endure the temptation until we make it to the escape and then get through the escape. And so, right, we understand that Satan, if allowed, would destroy us immediately. Right? Satan has to go to God in the story of Job and is allowed to do certain things and not allowed to do certain things. Right? We understand that God is sovereign. And God doesn't allow the devil to take Job's life just as he doesn't allow the devil to take our lives. And he doesn't allow the devil to tempt us in a way that we would be overcome if we trust and rely in him, God. So God allows us to be tempted to such a degree that if we trust in ourselves, we will always fail. But we are tempted, we are limited in that temptation, that if we trust and rely on Him, we will always succeed. And we will succeed to the degree that we trust and rely and depend on God. And so God has promised not only to limit our temptation so that we can endure that temptation, but He has also provided a way to escape those trying times, the tempting times. And He won't force us to take that escape, but He will always, this is His promise and His faithfulness, He will always give us the way to escape. It will always be available for us. And it's up to us to rely on God and take the escape He has provided. Right? And so the way of escape, the words that are used for in Greek for the way of escape give an image of a mountain pass. And it's this idea of an army being surrounded by the enemy. And they have a way of escape through a mountain pass. Right? The way of escape is difficult. It is narrow. But it is there. And it's the same thing with us. Right? The way of escape from temptation is always going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. It's going to be perhaps painful. It's going to be small. It's going to be narrow. It's going to be perhaps very little, if no room for error. But it is there nonetheless. Right? The way of escape isn't necessarily an easy way, but it is a way, the only way to escape. And right, we're not escaping to a place where there is no temptation. Right? That doesn't happen until we die. But the way of escape is to get to a place where we are able to bear it, where we are able to resist. Right? And so we have to go from enduring a temptation, right? When we are initially faced with a temptation, we must endure that temptation. And when we rely on God and take His way of escape, we can get to a place where we would be able to bear the temptation, where we would be able to resist the temptation. That's where we want to be, in a place where we can resist temptations, bear temptations, instead of just enduring temptations. So then he goes on to say, verse 14, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. And so, let me go back to verse 14. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. And so, right, the Corinthian Christians have the liberty to buy meat that has been sacrificed to idols from the markets, right, and eat it in their homes. But Paul is saying, you may have the liberty to do that, but you don't have the liberty to do the things that they were doing. And that's what he's going to discuss here. And so his initial admonition is flee from idolatry. And he uses the image of Israel. Israel failed to flee from idolatry, and they did not finish the race. They did not finish the race that God had set before them. Idolatry is dangerous. Is a dangerous, dangerous, dangerous thing to be dealing with. And so, as he's going to go on to say, he's going to tell the Corinthian Christians not to participate in dinners that are being held in the pagan temples. That's what he's really going to be discussing here. Verse 15, I speak as to wise men, judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing, which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, though many, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. And so he's saying here, Paul's point is, just as the Christian practice of communion is pointing to unity and fellowship with Jesus, so the pagan fellowships, the pagan dinners and banquets that are given in the honor of their idols, are a unity and fellowship with the demons, the not demons, but the powers and principalities that were benefiting from that worship. Right? So Paul is trying to get the Corinthians to understand, right? We partake in communion. And when we partake in the blessed cup, when we partake in the body, we are all one body. As we partake of one bread, we are all one body. It was this idea in the ancient world that when you eat with someone at the same table, it indicated fellowship and friendship with the people. And because you ate of one bread, you became one body. Right? Everybody there that was participating in the meal had become one. Right? The group had become an individual body. And it's the same thing with the church. That's why the communion is so important. Communion is the means by which we are one body. Because we fellowship. We fellowship and we are a unity. We are unified to each other and to Christ in communion. And so he's saying, because you both shared of the same food, you have become one body. And so to eat at the table of a pagan temple was not just this innocent, oh, I'm going to eat dinner because they invited me to eat dinner. And so he's trying to get them to understand the importance of communion. And he uses our communion, Christian communion, to get them to understand the spiritual significance. Right? When we partake in communion with each other, we identify with Christ. When the pagans hold their dinners and communion, they identify with the powers and principalities that they serve. Right? The idols aren't real. Zeus isn't real. But there are powers and principalities that were over Greece, that were at this time, that are over Rome, and they benefit from the worship to these idols. They take that worship and attribute it to themselves. And that is what is going on here at the pagan temples. Paul's trying to get them to see there is a spiritual aspect of the pagan communion that they are not understanding, that they are not appreciating the depth and gravity of the situation. And so, right, the Corinthian Christians were thinking, since an idol isn't real, and so let me keep reading. Observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is anything? Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? And so here he's saying, right, he goes back to the Old Testament. Think of Israel, right? Those who eat of the sacrifices are partakers of the altar, right? So even in the Old Testament, the people who were eating of the sacrifices participated in the altar. They were partakers of the altar, right? If you ate of the sacrifices, you were eating of this. You were partaking in the one who the sacrifices were made to, right? So when the Israelites made sacrifices to God, they partook of the altar by eating of a part of the animals that they were sacrificing. And that's what he's saying here, right? If you're eating the meats that are sacrificed to the idols, in a sense, you are partaking of the altar on which they were sacrificed. Then he goes on to clarify, I'm not saying that the idol is something. There is no substance to the idol. It is a material object
that does nothing. And the meat in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with the meat. It's the way in which you are eating the meat that is wrong. That's what he's trying to say. The Corinthian Christians were saying, as long as we participate in the Lord's table, right, if we have communion with God, we're safe. And he's saying, no, you disgrace God's communion when you participate in his communion and you participate in the communion of the devil, of demons.
Yep.
And in doing so, you provoke the Lord to jealousy. And so unknowingly, the Christians in Corinth were fellowshipping with demons by participating in these dinners at pagan temples. And they were provoking God to jealousy, right? He has the right to our worship and therefore has the right to be offended when we give that worship and fellowship to demons, to powers and principalities, to the rulers of the age. And so it doesn't really matter whether the Corinthian Christians were intending to worship demons at these feasts in the pagan temples, right? An example would be, if a man puts his hand on a hot stove, it doesn't really matter whether he intends to get burnt. He gets burnt. It doesn't matter about his intention of what he wanted to happen. What matters is what's happening. And that's what Paul is trying to point out. And so he's trying to clarify. It's not the idols and it's not the meat that is wrong. It is the atmosphere of participating in pagan religious activities in the temples. That is what is wrong. Because even though the idols, right, the statues, there's nothing about the statues, but there are powers and principalities behind these idols. And when we worship those idols, and when we go into these places of worship to those idols, we are fellowshipping not with the idols, right? They're not real. The gods that these people think they have, they're not real. But there are real things. There are real spiritual entities that feed off of our misdirected worship. Right? When we don't worship God, we are worshiping something. And whatever that worship is, they want it. And they take it for themselves. Right? There's a spiritual reality where even though the idols may not be actual living gods, there are evil spiritual entities that feed off of our idolatry. They take that worship that's not given to God and they take it for themselves. And he's trying to say your eating in the temples is, right? He's trying to bridge the example here, right? Just as we give our worship to God and we fellowship and unify ourselves to God in communion, right? Holy communion. Well, in the same way, when you eat at these temples, you are giving worship to and fellowshipping with these evil spiritual beings. And so he's trying to get them to understand this spiritual reality that they're failing to realize. And so verse 23, he says, all things are lawful for me, right? They're not under the law anymore. So all things are technically, without a law, all things are lawful. And so he says, all things are lawful for you, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. And so he says, let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. And so the Corinthian Christians were focused on their rights and their knowledge. And so they said, what is the harm to me in doing this thing? Instead of asking, what is the good to me for this thing? Right? They had the wrong attitude. They had the wrong idea of the motivations for their actions. right? And so the principle is just because something is permitted doesn't mean that it's beneficial, doesn't mean that it is pleasing to God. And the Corinthians were not seeking helpful things or things that would edify. And so instead of going forward with Jesus as much as they possibly could, they wanted to know how much they could get away with while still being called Christians.
Right.
It's an approach that a lot of people have. A lot of people approach the Bible as a rule book, and they go, what are all of the things that I like doing that I can keep doing and call myself a Christian? Wrong. It's what are all of the things that I am now capable of doing that I couldn't do before, now that Christ lives in me. That has to be our attitude.
Right.
Is not what is the most evil I can partake and participate in while not being evil in myself. It's how far away from evil can I get? Right? The example of slavery. Slavery in the free man that Paul uses where he says, you've been set free. You're no longer slaves, so why would you go back to slavery?
Right.
A slave who has been set free is not going to go back to the slave master and go, I want to be as close to a slave without being a slave as possible.
Right.
No one would ever do that. No one would ever go and want to be not a slave, but as close to it as possible. The whole idea is you've been set free. Be as free as you can be. And so they had the Corinthian Christians, and a lot of Christians today have the wrong idea of what freedom means. Right? Liberty is not a license to sin. Liberty is when we have been set free, it is to experience freedom in a way that we couldn't before. Right? We can experience things now in a way that is free that we couldn't before when we were slaves. We can do things now in a free way instead of an enslaved way. And so the attitude has to be right. The idea, the Corinthian Christians were treating freedom as a way of getting to do whatever they wanted without consequences, instead of realizing that freedom was the opportunity to get as far away from slavery as possible. Mm-hmm. They had the wrong attitude. They had the wrong conception of freedom and its relationship to slavery.
Yep.
Right? They just wanted to do everything that they were doing as slaves, but as free men. That's what the Corinthian Christians were doing. I want to do all of the slave work that I did, right? When I was enslaved to sin, I did them as an enslaved man. I want to keep doing those things that I did while I was enslaved to sin. I just want to do them as a free man. That's not the thinking that any free man has, right? In the real world concept of freedom and slavery.
Yeah.
That is an incorrect understanding of the relationship between a free man and a slave. An incorrect understanding of freedom is to go, I'm going to use that freedom to do all of the same things I did as a slave, just as a free man. You're not really free. You're still a slave. You're still a slave in your mindset. And that's what he's trying to point out to them. You're still a slave in your minds. You're still enslaved to your flesh and its desires because you're still acting like a slave to sin. You've been set free, be free. Act free. And what does a free man do? He runs from the slavery. He does everything you couldn't do as a slave. He does. But it's not just about doing the things. It's the essence of who he is. The slave gets as far away from everything attributed to slavery because the more and more and more he rinses himself of slavery, the more and more free he is. And so the principle is just because something is fine doesn't mean that I should do it. Just because I have a right doesn't mean that I should exercise it. Just because I know that something is permitted to me doesn't mean that I should absolutely do it. Right? We have to consider, before we consider what I'm allowed to do, I must consider what I should do out of love to my brothers and sisters and to God. So verse 25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience' sake, for the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Right? And so he's saying here, if you want to go into the markets and buy this meat, go ahead and do that. Right? It's God's. God made the animals. It's God's meat that you're eating. It's God's provision to you. But don't ask about it. When you go into the market and buy meat, don't ask if it's been sacrificed to idols. Why? And don't get that on your conscience. Just don't even bother asking about whether. Don't even bother asking whether the meat has been sacrificed to idols. Just go and buy it and eat it.
And thank God for it.
And so, yeah, exactly. Thank God for it. And verse 27, if any of those who do not believe invites you to dinner and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no questions. Right? So if the person who doesn't believe invites you to dinner, don't ask them whether that meat that they're serving you has been sacrificed to an idol. Just eat the meat. Just eat the dinner as it's dinner provided to you by God and give Him thanks. Don't even bother with these questions. And so Paul is saying it's not about the meat. The meat itself doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's been sacrificed to idols. It matters whether you know it's been sacrificed to idols in terms of your strong and weak conscience. And what matters is the partaking of the atmosphere of the pagan temple. Right? So if you don't even know that the meat is sacrificed to idols, if that's not even on your conscience, there's no possibility for you to possibly be partaking in the atmosphere of the pagan temples, which is condemned. And so just don't even think about it. Just don't even talk about it. Don't even ask about it. Just eat the meat. But then he goes on to say, but if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it, for the sake of the one who told you, and for the conscience' sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Right? So he says, if someone tells you, right? If a Christian is warned that his food, either by an unbelieving person or another believer, tells you that the meat has been sacrificed to idols, don't eat that meat. Why? Not because it's wrong, right? Not because the meat itself is tarnished or impure. That's what he's trying to get them to understand. Yes, the meat is pure. You can eat it, but don't. You can eat it, don't eat it. For the sake of the person who has told you, right? If an unbeliever tells you they sacrifice their meat to an idol, what kind of witness does it bear to that unbeliever if you go ahead and say, okay, let me eat that meat? Not because it is tarnished, but because of what the person will think when they see you eating it. And what the person will think if they see you resist it, reject it. That's the thing that we have to keep in mind. What is the witness that we're bearing? Not are we allowed to do this thing or not? And the same thing goes not just if an unbeliever tells you the meat is offered, but if a Christian tells you the meat is offered to an idol, especially if you know that Christian, if you know the Christian is a weak brother, right? Because if you eat the meat sacrificed to the idol, and your brother is weak, but sees you eating it, he possibly will eat the meat. And you have led your brother to stumble because you refuse to resist, because you refuse to have discipline. You refuse to give up your right to eat that meat. And so he says, verse 29, conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? So he says, your liberty is not determined by anyone's conscience but your own. Right? If you are alone and you don't have to worry about anybody else seeing you or thinking about it, if you're alone, you can eat whatever meat you want. It can be sacrificed to idols, it can be not sacrificed. You can eat whatever meat you want. Any meat that you want to eat, fine to eat. And this is the principle for anything and everything. Right? If this thing, you are convinced and convicted that this thing is acceptable in the eyes of God, you are at liberty to do it, and you are alone, there is nothing to say you cannot do it. Paul says, go ahead and do it. If you want to do it and you're alone, go ahead and do it. But when you're not alone, don't think of yourself. Right? The principle of don't put yourself first. Mm-hmm. Put everyone and everything else before yourself. That is the I mean, when we understand that the heart of the law, the heart of the Old Testament, the heart of everything that led up to Christ was love God and love your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's put them first. Everything that you do, everything that you think, everything that you say, put them through the filter of what does God think of this? And what do the people think of this? Who am I with? Am I with unbelievers? Okay, what kind of witness am I bearing? How is the gospel being demonstrated here? How is the gospel being eased to these unbelievers by my actions? What is the witness that I'm bearing that would ease the acceptance of the gospel for these unbelievers? And if I'm with believers, are they weak or are they strong? And if there are any that are weak, I love them so much that I would refuse to do things that I know I can, that they would not have any opportunity to stumble. And so while it might seem like Paul is being inconsistent, he's not. The consistency is you are at liberty, but that liberty is confined and limited by love. Exercise your liberty, and exercise it with love, with compassion, with empathy, with your focus on everyone else and God before yourself. That's how the Christian ought to exercise liberty. Not, I get to do whatever I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it, because I'm set free by God. That's not liberty. That's just redefined slavery. That's just redefined slavery to your flesh and its desires and sin. That's the slavery you've been set free from. That's not liberty. Liberty is being capable now that Christ is living in you to put yourself last. You can't do that. You can't put God first when you're enslaved to sin, but you've been set free. Now you can put God first. Now you can put others before yourself every single time. That's liberty. That's freedom. Liberty is getting to do things, having all things available to you, and saying, I'm going to put that ability aside that I might love God and love my neighbor all the more. And so then he says, therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God.
Right. Through our actions, let others glory in God.
Exactly. Yeah. Everything that you do glorify God in it. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved.
Amen.
Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ.
Right.
Right.
And so, the purpose of our lives isn't to see how much we can get away with and still be Christians. The purpose of our lives, the purpose of the race that we run is to glorify God. If the Corinthian Christian kept this principle, everything, there are no problems to address. Right? All of these problems that he's addressing is because the Corinthian Christians are putting themselves first. Their own freedom, their own rights, their own liberty, their own desires. I want to eat meat, and I know that I can, so I'm going to. Wrong. That's the wrong way of living. It's the wrong way of thinking. It's the wrong... It's entirely antithetical to the Christian mindset.
Right. True.
You're not imitating Paul, and you're certainly not imitating Christ. You're just doing what you want to do. And that's not the point. That's not the purpose. And when you walk in that way, right? When you walk in such a way as it is impossible for others to identify you with Christ, you ought to think about whether you are identified with Christ or not. That's the whole point. The whole point of getting baptized, identifying with Christ, being saved, being transformed, being filled with the Holy Spirit, is you are capable now of being conformed to Christ. You can live and breathe and talk and think and see more and more and more like Christ, like Jesus. And if you're not doing that, then something's wrong, something's missing. You're either not appreciating who Jesus was and how beautiful it is that we get to increase in our conformity to him. And especially if nothing changes, you ought to question, as very many others do, whether you are actually identified with him. If you don't seek to conform to him, right, to increase in your identification with Christ, it may be the case that you don't identify with him at all. Right? The natural consequence of identifying with Jesus is wanting to be identified with him all the more. And so, and then Paul says, give no offense, right? And an offense is an opportunity for someone to sin, to stumble. And he says that none of our behavior should encourage others to sin. Right? If we're doing that, then we are in that behavior has become sinful. When we participate in things we know can cause other people to sin, we are sinning.
Right.
In our lack of love for them, in our lack of conformity to Christ, in our lack of putting God first, right? In a sense, we are creating an idol out of ourselves. We are creating an idol out of our freedom, out of our liberty, out of our knowledge. And so Paul's desire, his priority in everything was that men, that the brothers, not brothers, that all people would be saved, right? That was his desire. And a principle that is sorely lacking in the church today is this understanding that low conduct, right? If we have little care of how we are perceived by others, we have little care as to whether thus loss are saved. Right? The more regard we have for the lost, the more regard we have for the impact every single action we take has on the lost. Right? And what I am doing right now, is it glorifying to God, pleasing to God, and on top of that, is it bringing people to Christ? Is Christ shown through me to them? Is the gospel demonstrated to them? Is the transformative experience described in the Bible being demonstrated to these people so that the gospel might be more easily preached to them? Is what I am doing those two things? If it's not, if it's failing in one of those two regards, it's not an action worth making. It's not a thought worth having. It's not a word worth saying. It's not a thing worth doing if it fails in one of those two regards. To glorify and please and worship God faithfully in a way that runs the race the way He has set before us to run, and spreading the kingdom and the preaching of the gospel through words or actions, by the witness that we bear and the fruits, by the witness that we bear and the fruits that we bear.
Right. Yes.
And so, Paul's concern was not seeking his own profit as the Corinthian Christians. They were seeking their own profit, their own pleasure, their own purposes. Right. And Paul's concern was that all would be saved.
Right.
And so that's chapter 10. And I guess I'll finish this off with prayer. God, I pray that you would, I thank you for this time that we got to spend with you, this time that we got to spend in the Word and with each other. I pray that you would bless us, bless this Bible study, bless all those who are listening, and help us to understand what Paul has been talking about in these two chapters, and how it applies to our lives, and how it applies to being better disciples, bearing better witness, and bearing more fruit. God, I pray that you would increase in us the motivation and desire to do all that we do and be all that we are for you, for your love, for the love of you and the love of others. That everything that we do because we know that it is something that is glorifying and pleasing to you and is beneficial for others in the preaching of the gospel, in the salvation of their souls. God, I pray that you would help us transform our minds, transform our thoughts and our patterns and our habits. Help us to comprehend true freedom, true liberty in you, and what that means, right? Not that we can do whatever we want whenever we want it, but that we can be less and less and less like a slave, like the slave we were to sin. The less and less we are like a slave, the more and more and more free we are. Help us to comprehend that in a way that is practical and applicable to our lives. God, I pray that you would help us, give us opportunities to trust in you and rely on you and depend on you this week. God, I pray that you would help us to internalize and comprehend the truths that are spoken about temptation. God, that you would help us to understand that our temptations are not unique, that there are those who have struggled and perhaps have struggled worse than us in whatever we might be facing. To know that we are not alone, but that you are with us, and to know that when you are with us, and we are with you, that no temptation is too difficult to overcome. And we trust and rely on you to endure those temptations, and know that when we trust and rely on you, you will provide the way to escape those temptations in such a way that we would be capable of resisting and bearing those temptations. God, we thank you for your grace, your mercy, and the blood that you shed. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We'll be doing 1 Corinthians chapters 11 and 12 next week. God bless.